The first time I realized that something could change between my grandfather and me, I was caught off guard. To me, he had always been the safest place, a refuge from everything else that could go wrong in the world. My mother worked long hours, often taking multiple shifts to make ends meet. It was my grandfather who filled those gaps, becoming both a parent and a friend. When I was younger, Grandpa was like a hero straight out of a storybook. He always knew how to make me laugh, even when I felt like I had nothing to smile about. He taught me how to ride my first bike, helped me build forts out of sheets in the living room, and told me stories about his youth that felt like adventures lifted right from an old action movie. Every weekend spent at his house was an adventure of its own, and every bedtime story ended with the reassurance that I was safe, that he was always watching over me. When my mother mentioned her upcoming work trip and suggested I spend the next few weeks at Grandpa's, it felt like going back to my childhood, a comforting, familiar space. The day she dropped me off, he greeted me with that same broad, wrinkled smile and a big bear hug that made me feel like I was 5 again. There was no hesitation, no hint of unease, just warmth. My favorite girl. Come on in, I've got a surprise for you, he said, his eyes twinkling. The first few days were like a trip down memory lane. Grandpa made all my favorite meals: thick spaghetti bolognese, apple pie with extra cinnamon, pancakes for breakfast that we loaded with blueberries until they were more fruit than batter. We spent our evenings watching old movies, and he told me all the stories I'd heard before but never got tired of. In those moments, it felt like nothing could ever change. But it did change, and it all started so subtly that I wondered if I was just imagining it. It was small things at first, the kind that you might not even notice if you weren't paying close attention. A lingering touch on my shoulder that lasted a second longer than it should have, a gaze that seemed to hold me just a bit too long. One evening, as we were sitting in the living room, I caught Grandpa looking at me. It wasn't the soft, affectionate look I was used to. There was something else there. Something that made me uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that I was just being silly. But the look stayed with me. It was like a splinter under my skin, tiny, almost insignificant, but impossible to ignore. The unease grew slowly, a creeping shadow that followed me even during the day. I would catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, his eyes tracing me in a way that made my stomach turn. It was strange to feel this way about someone I had trusted my whole life. I wanted to shake it off, but a voice in the back of my mind kept whispering that something wasn't right. Then came the night that everything changed. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest, though I didn't know why. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you aware of every creak and groan of the old wood. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was just a bad dream. But then I heard it, the soft creak of footsteps moving down the hallway, growing closer to my room. I felt my breath catch, a wave of fear washing over me. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. My heart pounded, each beat reverberating in my ears. I watched, frozen, as the handle of the door turned ever so slightly. I didn't know what to do, whether to call out or stay silent. I told myself that it was just Grandpa checking on me, but another part of me knew that wasn't the whole truth. The door never opened. After a few moments, the handle returned to its original position, and I heard the soft retreat of footsteps. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my eyes fixed on the door, my heart refusing to settle. The next morning, I tried to act normal, but it felt like the ground beneath my feet had shifted. At breakfast, Grandpa was cheerful, asking if I wanted to go to the lake that afternoon. I forced a smile, agreeing, thinking maybe some fresh air would help me shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my chest. But as we sat across from each other, I felt his eyes on me again. He was watching me with that same strange intensity, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I decided to text my best friend, Rachel. I needed to tell someone what was happening, even if I didn't entirely understand it myself. As soon as she read my messages, she called me. "That's not normal, Anna," she said, her voice full of concern. "Lock your door tonight, okay? Just to be safe." Rachel's worry only added to my own fears, making them feel more real. I did as she said that night. locking my door before getting into bed. I tried to sleep, but every little sound seemed amplified, the creaks and groans of the old house like whispers in the dark. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized that someone was trying to open my door, the handle rattling violently, as if whoever was on the other side was angry that it was locked. "Grandpa?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer, just silence. After a few moments, the rattling stopped, and I heard footsteps moving away. I stayed up the rest of the night, my eyes glued to the door, my heart pounding. The next morning, I couldn't keep silent any longer. Over breakfast, I looked at Grandpa, my hands trembling as I spoke. "Grandpa, did you come to my room last night?" He looked at me, his face blank. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at me. Then he shrugged. "I thought I heard something. I wanted to make sure you were okay." His words were casual, but there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the comforting explanation I had hoped for. I nodded, trying to act like I believed him, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The tension in the house grew unbearable. I stayed in my room most of the day, only coming out when necessary. That night, I lay in bed, my nerves on edge, unable to sleep. I couldn't take another night like this. I decided that if I heard the footsteps again, I would confront him. Around midnight, the silence was broken by the familiar sound of footsteps approaching my door. My body tensed, my pulse quickening. I waited until the footsteps stopped, and then, with my heart pounding in my ears, I threw off the covers and crossed the room. I unlocked the door and opened it abruptly, startling him. Grandpa stood there, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, we just stared at each other. "Why are you outside my door every night?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear that gripped me. He looked away, his expression tense. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. Grandpa, this isn't normal. You're making me feel uneasy. If you care about me, you need to respect my space." He looked at me for a long time, something shifting in his expression. Finally, he nodded, almost reluctantly. "I'm sorry if I made you feel that way," he said quietly. After that night, he stopped lingering outside my door, but the tension between us never disappeared. I spent the rest of my time there keeping my distance, counting down the days until I could leave. When my mother finally came to pick me up, I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I climbed into the car. Things between Grandpa and me were never the same after that. We spoke less, and when we did, it was strained, awkward. I never confronted him again, never asked why he had done the things he did. I just wanted to forget it all. Even now, years later, I still think about those weeks I spent at Grandpa's. I think about the look in his eyes, the footsteps outside my door, the fear that kept me awake night after night. I wonder if I was overreacting, if maybe it was all in my head. But deep down, I know the truth. I know what I felt, and I know that listening to my gut kept me safe. I've learned to trust my instincts, to protect myself when something doesn't feel right. And even though I may never fully understand what happened during those nights at Grandpa's house, I know one thing for certain: I will never ignore that voice in the back of my mind again.